Hello and welcome to Writing Essentials with Mrs. Benson. Today we're going to be talking about an important element of most narratives, and that is dialogue. So let's get started. So, dialogue, characters speaking to one another. Why do we need it in a narrative? So, here are some of the primary benefits of including dialogue in your narrative. First one, it makes the story advance. And I would add that it makes the story advance at quite a quick pace. It takes a lot longer for a narrator to explain in narration what happened in a conversation rather than just give the conversation. So you can increase the pace of your narrative and get things accomplished by making the story advance through a conversation that characters have with one another. Another good benefit of dialogue is that it helps develop character. What a character says and how that character says it says a lot about who that character is and his or her characteristics. So, if you think about dialogue as being the window into the character, it is a really great reflection of what that character says. And what we say says a lot about our personality and who we are. So, it's an important way of developing your character and giving a more well rounded view of your character. The third point there says that dialogue brings dynamics. We want to add ebbs and flows in our narration to speed up the pace, to slow it down, to spend more time on one component rather than another. As writers, we make all those choices, and dialogue is faster paced than narration. So it brings dynamics. So it allows your story to have that sense of movement in the pace and in the rhythm of your storyline. It's great to have dynamics. And then lastly, dialogue provides realism. In real life, we talk to one another, we speak. So it makes sense if you're giving a narrative and you're wanting it to be at all true to life and true to how humans are and live out their lives, you should include some dialogue because there aren't very many of us who go days on end without talking to one another. And in particular, in a story, when you're telling about something interesting and exciting or different or a worthy experience to convey to someone else, I imagine that there would be some dialogue involved in a lot of those experiences. So we're being more true to life if we include dialogue. Now, we know why we should do it. How should we do it? What does it look like? When we put dialogue into our writing, there are specific grammatical punctuation rules involved in order to really signal what's happening and so that your reader doesn't get lost. This is a lot like using MLA format. You do it so that your reader can have easy access and understand what you're saying rather than trying to sift through and figure out what's going on. Let's look at the first rule. You need to use quotation marks. So, quotation marks are the indicator that a character is speaking. So, they're pretty important. The example, help me, exclaimed the little girl. So, you just put whatever the character says, or if it was something from your life, whatever you said or the person said to you in quotation marks. Second rule is that you want to begin a new paragraph every time the speaker changes, every single time. So let's say it's a conversation between two people. You have person A and person B. When person A speaks, indent. When person B responds, indent. Then when person A comes back again, indent. So every single time the person switches, even if it's just back and forth between those two people, you want to indent. So here's an example. I'm coming home, Sue announced. I'm really tired and can't work anymore. Someone responds, okay, I think you should do that, her husband agreed. So notice how Sue's remark is indented and then her husband's remark is indented. And if Sue said something else after that, it would be indented. Rule 3, Make sure the reader knows who is talking. So look at that previous example again. Notice how I have the Sue announced in the first line, and then I have her husband agreed in the second line. We need those he said, she said notations so that it's easy to follow. It's easy for me to understand who is speaking. Do writers always utilize these? No. Sometimes writers kind of leave it to us to assume who is speaking, and that's their stylistic choice. But as a general rule, it's more helpful for your reader to know who is speaking and not have to try to guess. But again, you're changing your pace. When you leave words out, you're changing pace. So there might be some intentionality behind something like that. Last rule here is punctuation. The punctuation rules are a little bit different when you have dialogue. For example, when you have a quote that is actually asking a question, so the character is asking a question, you include a question mark in the quotation marks, and then you have your he said or she said. So here's an example. May I buy a new pair of shoes? Question mark, quotation mark, Lauren asked her mom. That's it. But then if I'm not asking a question or giving an exclamatory remark, then I'm implying that it's a period, but we don't use periods in our dialogue notations within the quotes. So look at this. I bought a new jacket yesterday, should end with a period, but because it's part of my dialogue, I put a comma, quotation mark, Tammy said. So insert a comma rather than a period in a quotation that is just a plain sentence, a plain declarative sentence that isn't with an exclamation point or a question mark. If you have multiple sentences in one piece of dialogue, you only do that with the last sentence. Okay? So just to recapitulate what we talked about, here's a graphic that kind of goes over several things that I mentioned. Periods and commas go inside quotation marks. That's important to note. Here's an additional rule that I didn't mention, which is really important. When you have internal dialogue or thoughts, things that you're thinking but don't say out loud or a character thinks, use italics. Italics are a great way for the reader to know, oh, this was a thought, this wasn't something said out loud. If we put our thoughts in quotation marks, it can get a little fuzzy for the reader to understand if it was said out loud or not. So definitely use italics for internal thoughts that are not spoken out loud. When you have a quote within a quote, so let's say my character is referencing a short story, and short stories are typically in quotes, you want to use single quotation marks, so just the one little mark there to denote that this is a short story or a poem or a song or something of that nature. If a quote lasts more than a paragraph, you use the quotes only when the character is done speaking. I don't expect this to happen often in narratives that you're composing for school, but let's say you're composing a narrative that's actually 10, 20, 30 pages and you have characters saying quite a bit, then you don't need the quotation marks when you start a new paragraph of each character's dialogue if it goes on for multiple paragraphs. And lastly, when a tagline interrupts a sentence, you want to offset that with commas. So if I want to put the he said or she said in the middle, so I have a little bit of a quote, he said, and more of a quote, you want to offset that with commas. That is, comma, Wesley said, comma, quotation, that neither you nor me is her boy. Okay? Now, my last note here, remember each time a character speaks, even if it's back and forth, you want to indent. And my last tip is when in doubt, take a look in a book because books from all the ages have dialogue. And so you can just open up a book you have on a shelf and see how it's formatted and then kind of check yourself to make sure you formatted it correctly. Once in a while, writers decide to do something different with dialogue. I've read novels where each piece of dialogue was introduced with a dash. And I've also read novels where there were very rare instances of letting me know who the speaker was, but those were from very sophisticated writers who had the intention of doing certain things with those added or manipulated elements of dialogue. So when you're first learning to write and you're writing narratives, I would stick with kind of convention and form and feel free to break the rules later. But when in doubt, look in a book. All right. I look forward to seeing the dialogue in your narratives. Take care.